I completed my final project over the Read Aloud accommodation. So before we get started, we need a little bit of background knowledge. So this is the sort of four-step process for how a child qualifies for special education. So the first thing is the child has to just qualify. They have to be identified as a child who's really struggling and needs support in order to close the gap between the child's current level of performance and where his or her own same age peers are. Second step is the determination. That's where the child gets specifically diagnosed under a specific category, like specific learning disability in reading, or specific learning disability in math, or autism, or any of the other similar categories. The third step is an IEP or a 504. An IEP or a 504 is written and agreed upon by the team, which includes the parents, teachers, administrators, qualified examiners, and so on. The final step is the implementation. So based upon what's written in that IEP, that is then a legally binding document that requires all of the things listed to be provided. And this is what's most important, is it has to be the least restrictive environment for the student's success. When we look at accommodations, it's important for us to look at what's least restrictive for the child. So IDEA 1997 introduced regulations for providing testing accommodations to students with disabilities on K-12 state assessments. The Oklahoma State Department of Education says accommodations are intended to reduce or even eliminate the effects of the student's disability, but they do not reduce the learning expectations. Testing accommodations for students with disabilities are intended to remove the construct irrelevant barriers to accessing or responding to test items while retaining the ability to measure the intended construct. So there's four different main groups of accommodations based upon what they are. The first is accommodations in setting, next is timing and scheduling, response, and then presentation. So the read aloud accommodation falls within the presentation category. The read aloud accommodation allows the test content or the material content in the classroom to be read aloud to test takers and to students in multiple modes. It can be pre-recorded audio, a human reader, or a computerized text-to-speech voice. The read aloud accommodation is the most frequently allowed accommodation on statewide assessments. So the read aloud accommodation is intended to be useful for students with specific print disabilities like blindness, low vision, and specific learning disabilities in reading. However, it is currently the most controversial accommodation. So there's kind of two different theories on what qualifies an appropriate and valid accommodation. So there's the interaction hypothesis or philosophy, which says the average scores obtained for the individuals with the accommodation needs to equal the average score of those without the accommodation. So basically, only the students with a disability benefits. And there's a picture of a student reading Braille there, so it's a very clear accommodation. Only the child who is blind or visually impaired would benefit from that accommodation of Braille. The other sort of theory of accommodation is called differential boost. This is an accommodation that that it says accommodations are appropriate even if a student without a disability would also benefit from it, as long as only the students with a disability are provided that accommodation, allowing their scores to increase on average. An example is the calculator. All students would benefit from using that on tests, but only a child with a learning disability in math would be provided that accommodation. So two very different sort of philosophies and theories on what constitutes an appropriate accommodation and then how to implement them. So there's sort of two main studies done that show very different results. This first one was done in 2007, and it looked at elementary-aged students. So students with disabilities, and they were provided the read aloud accommodation versus students without disabilities. So with that accommodation provided, the students with the disabilities on average, scored higher than those without a disability. So being given that accommodation gave them a huge step forward. This other study done in 2010 with secondary age students, it's the same thing. Students with disabilities provided the read aloud accommodation versus students without disabilities. Now with this one, the students with disabilities that were provided the read aloud accommodation on average scored lower than those without a disability, meaning that accommodation didn't benefit them enough. So really what this comes down to is what makes the difference. Why are those two studies showing two different results? So is it because the content that's being assessed is different? Are the elementary age students being assessed on their ability to learning how to read? So of course they're going to score better because that's what they're being assessed on, while the secondary students are being assessed on what they have learned by what they have read. And so it's just more of a little boost in their ability to access that content without changing what they're being assessed? Or is it the degree or the severity of their disability? Are the more mildly disabled students being offered the accommodation when really they shouldn't be because it's giving them an unfair advantage? So these questions have been debated for a while. So these two gentlemen in 2014 did a literature review of all studies that have examined the read aloud accommodation. So they pulled studies from 1998 to 2013 that compared scores with and without the read aloud accommodation on reading and math tests. And they collected 45 different studies. This is what they have found. For reading assessments, students with disabilities received differential score boosts of 0.34 standard deviation units, while students without disabilities received a differential boost of 0.21 standard deviation units. So that accommodation helped more the students with a disability than the students without, meaning it's a needed accommodation. While on math assessments, students with disabilities and students without disabilities both received score gains of 0.13 and 0.08 standard deviations, but there was no evidence of differential boost from the read aloud accommodations. So this brings up the question of, so who gets the accommodation then? It's not just if you're on an IEP, you automatically get it or you don't. So the Oklahoma State Department of Education has this blip in sort of their qualification for who gets this. In essence, the process of making decisions about accommodations is one in which the members of the IEP team need to decide this. That accommodation needs to level the playing field so that students with disabilities can participate in the general education curriculum. IEP team meetings that simply engage people in checking boxes on state or local compliance documents are not conducive or helpful, is basically what that's saying. So what it comes down to is students who are otherwise unable to participate in the general education curriculum. Those are the students who need to receive this accommodation. But that information needs to be provided in the PLEP, or the present levels of educational performance on the IEP. So we come back to this picture. This is a pretty common, popular picture of the difference between what is equal and what is fair. Well, this comes down to what accommodations are for. So that fence that all the students are trying to look over is supposed to be the participation in general education curriculum. They have to be able to look over that fence. They have to be able to pass their general education classes. So whatever level of support or height of boxes that student needs to look over the fence is what needs to be written on the IEP or 504. So how do they decide whether they're accessing the fence or not, or whether they're accessing the general education curriculum or not, outside of just grades? So this has to be recorded in the PLEP, or the present levels of educational performance. And that has data that shows, this is what it needs to have, data that shows a significant low level of print reading disability. So like reading fluency, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, etc. That when provided the accommodation of a read aloud, the levels improve enough to access the general education curriculum. So this means that when we are collecting data as we write IEPs, if we do not have a school psychologist that provides us reliable and valid assessments with the data in it, and we need to come up with those results ourselves or those score reports ourselves, we need to have baseline data that shows the need without the accommodation in place, and then the ability with the accommodation in place, showing that, ooh, this kid really needs this. If they don't have it read aloud, they're not going to pass. This brings up the question of the how. These are the three different most common modes of how this accommodation is implemented. So it can be on pre-recorded audio, a human reader, or delivered by computerized text-to-speech voice. I think right now what's most common is the computerized text-to-speech voice now that most schools have Chromebooks or iPads. It's very easy for apps and just for Apple products in general to read things aloud. So it's a relatively easy accommodation to give to students, but what's also really important to remember is that it's how this accommodation is given more specifically. When a teacher is giving a test, they can't stand up in the middle of the classroom and say, okay, today's your science test. So all my students on an IEP or a 504 need to leave the room, go take your test to this other room. You got to have your test read aloud. That, first of all, disobeys FERPA. But secondly, it's disrespectful to the student. It could embarrass them. It could make them feel like they don't belong in the classroom. So it's really important that as teachers provide this accommodation, they do so in a way that is respectful towards the student and obeys the law. So before class even starts, privately and quietly pulling the student off to the side and saying, okay, we're going to take the science test. So here's your test. Go ahead and go to this classroom. You can bring it to me by the end of the class period. And that student can privately walk off with the test and go take it. Or before that day even starts, they just schedule their test. They know, okay, today's my science classroom, but I'm taking a test, so I know I'm not going to go to my science room. I have to go to this room because so-and-so is going to read it aloud to me. This concludes my presentation.